Were we better off having been colonized? Well, of course not. That's a silly question. But this actually was a question that the Ethiopian intellectuals of the early 20th century were asking. Would Ethiopia have fared better if she benefited from the so-called technology and knowledge and all these things that Western civilization was able to acquire, through colonialism, through all of these things they were able to do to Africans? Would it have been better for Ethiopia to have been colonized, to, then benefit from said exploitation, from said oppression? Obviously, they didn't phrase it in such a way, but that is a question that came up. And so the Ethiopian educated elite in the first half of the 20th century were both friend and foe to his regime. Early theorizers on modernization and the predecessors to the educated elite that I have discussed in the Ethiopian Student Movement video, the educated elite during that time. And a survey of the Ethiopian intellectual tradition at this time reveals certain individuals whose ideas on administration, governance, and political economy, ideas that were most pertinent to the state building and consolidating project of Haile Selassie's government, actually were both a source of inspiration and the site of antagonisms. And one such example was the scholar Gebrehiwot Baykedagn. He was born in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, but he was later raised in Germany, where he attended medical school in Berlin. So he was very much among those Africans that, went overseas, got their education in the West, and, returned and, applied or wanted to sort of adopt some of the things that they learned in Europe, in their home country. Though he studied medicine, his preoccupation upon returning to Ethiopia was grappling with the question of modernization and how leaders could implement policies to that end. His experiences abroad had sort of made him cognizant of the reality of the backwardness of the Ethiopian polity, a backwardness he prescribed education. He writes, "If a nation had no knowledge, it is immaterial whether it has an independent state or not, for it is bound to be ruled by a people with knowledge. It is because they have knowledge that many Europeans come to Ethiopia in a state of poverty, but manage to prosper in no time and end up having Ethiopians as their servants." Now, there's a sort of knowledge determinism here, that, knowledge is the root to all types of power. But you also have to sort of buttress this with the very real reality of, okay, it's knowledge plus the ability to oppress. It is knowledge plus all of these different things, right? But anyway, that's what Gebrehiwot Baykedagn says. And so Gebrehiwot's thoughts on the role of foreign influence are not easily, categorized as either for or against it. To be sure, he was quite against colonialism and direct foreign control as it pertains to Ethiopia. However, he did see European ways of administration as not only exemplars for Ethiopia, but the balm and prophylactic to the backwardness that seemed to, shackle her development as they understood it at that point. So he continues, "Whoever opens his door to her, i.e. European mind, prospers. Whoever closes his door will be destroyed. If our Ethiopia accepts European mind, no one would dare attack her. If not, she will disintegrate and be enslaved." So historians since have noted that Gebrehiwot was not necessarily a victim of Eurocentrism in a strict sense, but rather a proponent of the indigenization of Western thought and forms of government as applicable to the governance of Ethiopia. For him, Japan was an example. So he writes, "Hence, let us hope that His Highness Menelik's heir would examine and follow the example of the Japanese government," unquote. However, the example and temptation of a foreign rule was evident among other intellectuals as well. So it wasn't just Gebrehiwot Baykedagn that was very much so interested in how can we apply everything that Europe has done to its benefit to our own context without necessarily sacrificing our culture, our way of life, and so on, right? So at this point, there was no notion of adopting Western thought and adopting Western forms of governance as inherently destructive to their ways of knowing, of their ways of organizing society, because at this point to them there was no organized society. There was no Ethiopian-esque sort of way to organize society, right? They just knew that what we were doing is not working. It's not working for modernization, and we're falling backwards. So what can we do, right? And so we started to look elsewhere. They started to look elsewhere. So the example of Japan was really popular because Japan was one of those countries that did manage to westernize politically and administration-wise without really doing it so culturally. right? So that became an example. However, the example and temptation of foreign rule was evident among, other intellectuals as well. So Tekla Mariam, he was another intellectual who backed this Japan model. So he said, sometimes I ask myself, would it have been better if the civilized nations had colonized us for a short period of time? The British had that opportunity twice, but because they were not prepared to help, they left the country without setting up anything. This was echoed by the likes of Afawerk Gebrehiwot and Workene Shete as well, but with the understanding that foreign rule would jumpstart the modernization process rather than allow colonization in perpetuity. These are the same intellectuals that jealously guarded Ethiopian independence and exhibited a mistrust of foreigners even, to the point they were seen as xenophobic by foreigners, but they were still able to have this thought. They were able to hold these two thoughts together of how can we use colonization to our benefit sort of thing. Now, what these nuanced positions on Ethiopian independence and modernization point to is the philosophy of gradual reform that the Empire of Ethiopia could implement. So rather than doing away with the imperial form of government itself and sort of starting from scratch, they were not about revolution in any sense. These individuals wanted to work with whatever leader was in power, affirm his rule and suggest ways that Ethiopia could be like the West without threatening the power of the central government per se. And this they were able to do while identifying that the true wealth of the country was agriculture and the labor value of the peasantry. And so this same sector of the educated elite also criticized the decadence of its own class and highlighted how the further emaciation of the peasantry and the enrichment of the nobility could only further erode any, patriotic feeling that might be espoused by the peasantry. So that is to the detriment of the empire at large. So no matter how concerned they might have seemed for the common man, it was in the sense of the common man's labor makes this empire that we know work because of labor exploitation. If said commoner was to be upset, was to wage war against said system because of the, exploitation, we can expect them to be patriotic and continue to work and continue to sort of build this idea of a nation that they don't feel a part of. But it wasn't a question of making them feel a part of the nation or anything like that, but patriotism. They write, someone deprived of the basic necessities of food and clothing has no reason to love his country. He cares little whether his state prospers or perishes. Thus, the state stands to lose if national wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few, and to gain if it is distributed equally. So the educated elite at this juncture of Ethiopian history, what Bahru Zawde has termed the first generation, though they were preoccupied with the modernization process and generally changing the organization of Ethiopia, they did not want to get rid of the same regime that won the Battle of Adwa in 1896. They saw what could be accomplished when the various regional lords of Ethiopia set aside their quarrels at the face of the existential threat in the form of the Italian invasion. Hence, they sought to use both foreign and domestic means of development as long as it was on Ethiopia's terms, preferably sooner than later. Now, again, this may seem contradictory, right? The very essence of colonization, the very essence of direct rule or even indirect rule is that you do not have a say. Having a say in your own immiseration or having a say in how much control one has over you is inherently a sort of paradoxical point, but they conceptualized it so. And so the student of the 60s, inherited the same questions regarding the best way to govern Ethiopia, the role of land and the role of both the working poor and the peasantry in realizing an Ethiopia that is not only independent in name, but in practice as well, right? So their intellectual predecessors, though they answer some of these questions, their inability to part with the imperial government and worse, sort of refraining from condemning all forms of foreign rule became something the students just could not look past, right? It's for this reason and a lot of others that the students were, accused of breaking with Ethiopian pasts and failing to unearth from what they saw was really the guk of reformism that so occupied the intellectuals of the early century. But the modernization efforts was not also just an intellectual question about, how can we modernize on Ethiopia's terms, right? It was also about creating the cultural means through which we can also modernize. And so the cultural scene was not safe from Haile Selassie's modernization efforts. If anything, art and the cultural productions really played a complementing role in the overall modernization effort that colored Haile Selassie's rule in the post-liberation period, that is, after 1941. So the establishment of the School of Fine Arts in 1958 was inaugurated by the hope that Ethiopian works of arts could, quote, make Ethiopia known more widely as a nation fully participating in the spirit and the substance of modern civilization. And I think this is key because, as we all know, one of the greatest timeless sort of critiques that has been made upon Ethiopian civilization as we know it is that, Ethiopia has been in this long slumber. She's not joined the world, in growing and developing all these different things. And I'm talking about Ethiopia in the sense of, like, even before this Ethiopian state was a thing in any way, right? Just a very general ahistorical idea of Ethiopia, right? And so this was very deliberate, right? Making Ethiopia known more widely as a nation, fully participating in the spirit and substance of modern civilization, right? It was a declaration that we are not lagging behind, and this is how we're going to show you that we indeed are not lagging behind. And so, as per Haile Selassie's philosophy of modernism, however, he also used pageantry and performance, architecture, art, and symbolism to reinforce his image as both a divinely anointed dynastic ruler and an enlightened champion of political and social reform. So, a very interesting line to toe. For Haile Selassie, modernity was not the establishment of a Western-style secular government that brought with it a system of checks and balances, ensuring power was not concentrated within a single position or a branch of government. Haile Selassie wanted the best of both worlds, right? He wanted a Western-style modern democracy that reinforced his reign as a conquering line of Judah, as the King of Kings, as the elect of God, as the defender of the faith. In fact, one condition of his reinstatement to the throne, once the Italians were expelled from Ethiopia in 1941, was that he takes measures to establish a constitutional monarchy, a promise that he ended up reneging on once he actually was established in power, right? So for him, modernization never actually entailed any sort of devolution of the, imperial power, right? It still needed him. It still needed power of the empire of the state to be vested within him, right? Within the emperor and, whoever succeeds him. So, of course, naturally, the cultural context was reflective of the political milieu and environment of what it was like under Haile Selassie, right? Haile Selassie's policies, right, at least his domestic policies were, for example, were best understood by the notion of modern Ethiopianism, right? Modernizing Ethiopia's industry and culture after the Western model, with, again, the caveat that the ultimate power is vested within him, a notion that is at this point quite démodé in parts of the Western world, right? Haile Selassie's power centralization before even formally inheriting the throne entailed making use of the intellectual class by using them to challenge the more traditional nobility. Even this class, however, was stratified in terms of in favor with the emperor, as Haile Selassie was more likely to prefer the domestically educated Ethiopians as opposed to those who learned abroad. Probably because those who learned abroad were a little bit more confrontational with him and a little bit more eager to, question the legitimacy of his reign. So with the elimination of, unruly regional leaders and the creation of a bourgeois bloc that was loyal to the emperor, Haile Selassie was playing this delicate game of both curbing those wealthy enough to wield influence and install those loyal to him in positions of power. So augmenting the optics of Addis Ababa, the capital, through architectural grandeur was also another way that Haile Selassie, built an image of a modernized Ethiopia, right? One that really hid the reality of the poverty-stricken peasantry that was largely what Ethiopia was. And so the architecture of the 1950s Addis Ababa reflected this modern yet regal aesthetic that Haile Selassie sought to achieve. And perhaps the greater oxymoron is that Haile Selassie recruited Italians, among other foreigners, to lay the foundations of buildings in an Ethiopia that is presumably free of colonial rule or colonial influence, right? And so, though Haile Selassie managed to create an image of infallibility as the emperor of one of the, older Christian civilizations in Africa, his ability to govern autonomously, however, were at first greatly impaired by the during the years after liberation, right? The expulsion of the Italians in 1941 gave way to a unilateral British domination. So with the 1942 agreement with Britain, Haile Selassie signed away what, should have been powers vested within his office. Would make the most sense in that context. Being the ruler of Ethiopia, you would think the liberation of Ethiopia would entail power going back to the indigenous ruler, no matter how much of a sellout he may be, right? But Britain's dominion over Ethiopia's finances, military, police, and just overall administration and territorial integrity angered the emperor, obviously, and he was, only too glad to begin building ties with the new superpower in town, right, the United States. And this was, an historical moment that Bahuru Zode has called the American era. So we go from the British era to the American era in our history of never being colonized. So, fun. So the Ethio-US Treaty of 1953 defined this relationship between the two countries in the following decades, argues Bahuru Zode. Right, and this is where the U.S. assisted Ethiopian military through the Military Assistance Advisory Group, and amazingly, by 1970, Ethiopia had come to absorb some 60% of U.S. military aid to the whole of Africa. 60% of all of the aid going to Africa was to Ethiopia in 1970. Though institutions like the military, education, public works, and Ethiopian Airlines, were established with the help of the Americans and sometimes direct control, as with the case of Ethiopian Airlines, these, upgrades did not garner a marked improvement in the quality and standard of life for the average Ethiopian. Suffice it to say that Ethiopia's internal administration was deeply influenced and controlled by Western direction. It was to the point that the 1955 Constitution was itself drafted by Americans. It espoused and imbued what should be the document that, embodies Ethiopia's multinational ethnic and or multinational ethic and aspirations with those of the United States. But, the logic of colonialism, neocolonialism, doesn't really care about, writing a constitution that would be relevant to the indigenous people when it's being drafted by, a new superpower, a new imperial superpower like the U.S., right? That's not, or was not, at the top of their agenda, right? So in the midst of, a catalog of the oxymoronic traits of Haile Selassie, both modern, and ancient, both a democracy and, an absolute monarchy, and, wanting both of an Ethiopian autonomy and foreign influence, among these oxymoron, paradoxical sort of values, the educated elite of Haile Selassie University, later to be UCAA, the University College of Addis Ababa, arguably the product of his modernization efforts, became the same ones that identified the infinitely contradictory nature of Haile Selassie's rule and in due time actively organized against it.